A millionaire CEO took his receptionist to a gala. What she did changed his life forever. She was just a receptionist. He was a billionaire CEO under fire. But when he took her to a gala dinner to save his company's image, what she did shocked everyone and changed everything. Stay with us, because this is not just a story about power, but about courage, truth, and a love no one saw coming. The top floor of Caldwell Enterprises was silent, the kind of silence that weighed on your shoulders. Outside, the Manhattan skyline glimmered like a field of distant stars. But inside, the glass office that loomed over the city, Alexander Caldwell stood completely still. The shadows of dusk painting sharp lines across his face. He wasn't a man who allowed uncertainty to rattle him. He was precise, decisive, a surgeon of numbers and strategy. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, he felt unsettled. The company had been through months of public scrutiny. A defective product had not only endangered consumer trust, but also invited legal battles and a dip in market confidence. Shareholders were whispering. Investors were fleeing. The gala tonight wasn't just a formality. It was his battleground. He needed to reclaim the narrative. He needed to look invincible. Everything had been prepared to the last detail. His speech, his suit, his statements. Even the person by his side had been carefully selected until she canceled. "Sir," Christine's voice broke through the intercom, hesitating. "We have a problem. Claudia can't make it. Food poisoning." Alexander exhaled, his mind immediately sorting through options like files in a cabinet. Claudia had been the perfect choice. Polished, strategic, capable of disarming a hostile room with a single smile. Anyone else from PR would look like a last-minute fill-in. Too rehearsed, too obvious. He turned to face the city. What would surprise them? What would intrigue the skeptical and reinvigorate the weary? Someone no one saw coming. "Send up Eva from reception." There was a pause. Christine's voice came back, uncertain. "Eva Rodriguez?" "Yes, that Eva, now." Minutes later, Eva stood at the threshold of his office. She looked like she didn't belong there. She wore the company's navy receptionist blouse and black slacks. Her posture was respectful, almost timid, but her eyes, there was something in them. Steady, alive. "Miss Rodriguez," Alexander began, his voice clipped but not unkind. "I need someone to accompany me to a gala dinner tonight. I won't pretend this is about you. It's about optics. You'll remain by my side. Say little, observe, smile when necessary. Nothing more. Understood?" Eva blinked, and for a moment he thought she might refuse. Then she tilted her chin slightly. "Yes, sir, I understand." Alexander nodded once. "Christine will arrange a dress. A driver will collect you at 6:45 sharp. Do not be late." As she turned to leave, he watched her go, a flicker of curiosity crossing his face. He had no idea who she really was. Not yet. At 6:45, the black sedan waited outside her apartment. Eva stepped into the car with a quiet grace that betrayed her nerves. The emerald dress fit like it had been born from her skin, elegant in its simplicity. Her hair, usually tied back, now framed her face in soft waves. She held no clutch, no jewelry beyond a delicate silver bracelet, an heirloom from her late grandmother. But when she arrived, Alexander did something rare. He stared. He masked it quickly. "You clean up well." Eva smiled faintly, her voice low. "I followed instructions. They said little during the ride." She looked out at the city. He rehearsed his points. But underneath, Ava's mind raced. What was she doing here? This wasn't her world. She knew her place. Behind a desk, scheduling visitors, managing calendars. But a small, defiant voice whispered, maybe you belong in more places than you think. The Grand Marquette Hotel glowed like something from a dream. Lights strung above the marble entrance, the red carpet lined with photographers. When Alexander stepped out of the car, the flashes began. He turned and offered his hand to Eva. She took it, steadying herself. As they walked the carpet, whispers stirred like wind in tall grass. Who is she? Not the PR exec. Is Caldwell dating his staff now? Inside, chandeliers hung like frozen fireworks, casting golden light across glass walls and velvet drapes. The air was full of perfume and power. Stay close, Alexander murmured, and keep your comments to yourself. Eva gave a small nod. But her heart was rising in her chest like a tide. They drifted through clusters of executives, exchanging cool pleasantries and rehearsed laughs. Then came Samuel Greer, a venture capitalist known for testing boundaries. Older, sharp-eyed, always circling like a hawk. Alexander, he said, shaking hands. And who might this be? An intern with exquisite taste? Alexander opened his mouth, but Eva was faster. Eva Rodriguez. I work reception at Caldwell Enterprises. Samuel's smile froze. Then slowly, it shifted. Well, that's unexpected. He turned to her fully. Tell me, Ms. Rodriguez, how does it feel working at a company under so much public scrutiny? Eva felt every eye turn to her. The silence was pregnant. Her throat tightened, but then she took a breath. I think moments like this show who we really are. A company's value isn't just in its product. It's in the way it treats people, from the boardroom to the front desk. Samuel raised his eyebrows. A pause. Then he laughed, genuinely. Alexander, I like her. She sees the cracks most of you don't. Alexander said nothing, but something shifted behind his gaze. As the evening went on, Eva became the whisper in every conversation. Investors asked her opinion. Executives circled back to meet her. They didn't just see a pretty face. They saw clarity, courage, and Alexander Caldwell, master of control, found himself doing the unthinkable. He listened. The night's afterglow still lingered in the corners of Alexander's mind the following morning, though he would never admit it aloud. As sunlight stretched into his corner office, casting long lines across polished marble, he sat unmoving behind his desk. His fingers hovered above the keyboard, yet no words came. Not because he had nothing to say, but because, for the first time in years, his thoughts weren't entirely his own. They were tangled with the image of Eva Rodriguez. She had unsettled something in him last night, not by disobeying his instructions, but by doing exactly what he never expected, speaking the truth, with grace, with strength, without fear. He had watched her captivate the very people he had spent years trying to impress through strategy and power. She'd done it with authenticity. A knock pulled him back. Christine stepped in, holding a file. Morning briefing, sir. Also. She hesitated. There's a bit of buzz from last night. Alexander raised an eyebrow. Buzz? You, with Eva. Apparently several investors were more interested in what she said than in your 5-year plan. He stiffened. He didn't appreciate being eclipsed, not even by someone whose integrity had become impossible to ignore. Christine set the folder down and added, I just thought you should know. People are talking. He didn't respond until the door clicked shut. At reception, Ava was back in her navy blouse, her heels scuffed from years of wear, but her expression calm. She moved with her usual precision, sorting deliveries, signing off documents, fielding calls. Yet inside, a quiet storm was building. What she had said last night hadn't been planned. It had come from a place deep within, one forged by years of being underestimated. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd gone too far. Before she could spiral further, her phone rang. "Miss Rodriguez," came Alexander's voice, cool and deliberate. "My office. Now." She stood, palms damp. The walk up was short, but the tension stretched with every step. When she entered, he was standing by the window, back to her. "You were told not to speak, and you did," he began. Not with anger, with something else, measured disapproval. "And now you're the headline. Investors have called my office this morning asking about you. Not the company, not me. You." Eva drew in a breath. "I didn't seek attention, sir. I only answered what was asked." He turned, studying her. "You deflected better than most PR directors I've employed. Is that a compliment or another warning?" He didn't smile, but a flicker of something passed through his eyes. "Sit." She obeyed, folding her hands over her lap. "Tell me something," he said, returning to his chair. "How long have you worked here?" 3 years this October." 3 years, and no one knew your name until last night. Ava straightened. "That's not unusual for people like me. People like you. Support staff. We're the ones who make the company look polished without ever being seen." Alexander watched her, then opened a folder. Inside were the morning investor reports. One line stood out. "Rodriguez impressed with clarity and sincerity. Should be elevated." He tapped the sentence. "How would you feel about a different role? Something more visible?" She blinked. "I don't understand. Corporate affairs. Public insight liaison. It's not reception, Eva. It's strategy. You'll sit in on senior meetings, speak when others won't." For a moment, she couldn't find her voice. "Why me?" "Because people listened." Eva's chest tightened. It wasn't just a promotion. It was a challenge, a test. "If I say yes," she asked, "will you expect me to stay quiet again when I disagree with you?" He met her gaze, and something unspoken passed between them. Respect, and maybe something more fragile, something neither dared name. "No," he said finally. "I'll expect you to speak. Just choose your moment wisely." When she left his office, Christine glanced up, startled by her return so soon. "Everything all right?" she asked. Eva simply nodded, clutching the folder to her chest. Everything just changed. By midday, the office buzzed with whispers. Eva's new title appeared in the internal bulletin, along with a brief announcement from Alexander himself. The move shocked everyone. Receptionist didn't get promoted to corporate strategy. But no one could deny what they saw last night. That afternoon, Eva sat in her new corner of the building, a glass office far removed from the lobby. Her name on the door, her voice, now officially part of the executive ecosystem. But as the sun dipped low once more, she knew this was only the beginning. Some eyes watched with curiosity, others with envy, and one pair, cool, precise, unreadable, watched from the other end of the floor, wondering what the hell he'd just done. For the first time, Alexander Caldwell had invited someone into his guarded world. Not a strategist, not a PR expert, just a woman who dared to speak the truth in a room built on polished lies. And she was about to change everything. Eva adjusted the collar of her navy blazer, her first real piece of corporate armor, and stepped into the conference room for her first strategy session as public insight liaison. The long glass table gleamed under the overhead lights, surrounded by senior executives who, just a week ago, had never so much as acknowledged her presence. Now their eyes followed her, some curious, others skeptical. Alexander Caldwell sat at the head of the table, as composed as ever, but Eva noticed the smallest change. He no longer looked through her. He looked at her, as if waiting to see what she'd do with the space he'd made for her. The meeting began with quarterly forecasts and shifted quickly into reputational risk. A rising tide of social media backlash had begun to tarnish Caldwell Enterprises' name, sparked by whispers of internal discontent and cold, impersonal leadership. "We need to get ahead of this," said Natalie Tran, head of branding, flipping through a stack of slides. "We can pivot the narrative, launch a campaign, highlight philanthropy, show face at some local events." Alexander remained still, expression unreadable. "That's surface polish. It won't fix a cracked foundation." It was a rare admission from him, and Eva felt a beat of surprise ripple through the room. He turned to her. Eva, as the newest person at this table, and the one who earned her seat the loudest, what would you do? It was the kind of challenge that could make someone crumble. But Eva had learned to find her footing where none existed. "I'd start with listening," she said, voice steady. "Internally. The backlash isn't just online noise. It's an echo. People talk when they don't feel heard. We need to engage with employees, not through memos, but in person. Get leadership to walk the floors. Hold listening forums, not scripted, not curated, just presence." Murmurs circled the table, some impressed, some cautious. "Public transparency without internal authenticity won't work," she continued. "If we want to rebuild trust, we need to earn it. That starts from within." Alexander's gaze held hers for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Put together a plan," he said. "Start with the New York office. I want an employee feedback form scheduled by next week." Eva's heart thudded, but she masked it with a nod. "Understood." As the meeting ended, executives filtered out, some offering curt nods her way, others ignoring her altogether. But Alexander lingered. "You surprised them," he said quietly. "I wasn't trying to," Eva replied. "Exactly." She caught a flicker of something. Was it pride? Before he turned and left. Back at her new office, Eva dove into the task. She met with HR, coordinated logistics, drafted agendas. But more than anything, she listened. She went to the break rooms and cafeterias. She spoke to the mailroom staff, the IT department, the assistants who rarely made eye contact with executives. And she didn't just ask for feedback. She remembered names, stories, details. By the end of the week, the forum was ready. It was held in one of the company's largest internal auditoriums. Rows filled quickly, employees curious and wary. Alexander arrived 10 minutes late, dressed impeccably as always, but his usual air of authority had softened into something quieter. Eva took the mic first. "This isn't a speech," she said. "It's an invitation. Talk to us. Tell us what needs to change." At first, the silence was deafening. But then, a young woman from marketing stood. "We feel invisible," she said. No one knows what we do until something breaks. A man from facilities followed. We haven't had a raise in 3 years. We're told the budget's tight. But then we see lavish executive dinners on company cards. The words came faster after that. Frustrations, suggestions, hopes. Alexander stood in the back, arms folded, listening, not interrupting. When it was over, he stepped forward. Not to defend, not to dismiss. Every company has cracks, he said, but we've let ours widen for too long. That ends now. You have my word. There was no applause, but there was a kind of stillness. A weight lifted. Later that evening, Eva returned to her office, exhausted but exhilarated. She stared at the wall, unsure whether to laugh or cry. The knock at her door startled her. It was Alexander. "You did well," he said, stepping inside. "Thank you. But this is just the start." He nodded, leaning against the doorway. "I didn't think this would work. Not really, but I was wrong." She studied him. "Why did you bring me to the gala, Alexander?" He looked away for a moment. "Honestly? Desperation. Megan canceled. You were there." She smiled slightly. "And now?" He met her eyes. "Now I see you, and I'm not sure I can unsee what you're capable of." There was no romance in his tone, just honesty, but something shifted in the air between them. Something neither dared name. That night, Eva left the office late. As she walked through the quiet halls, passing the reception desk where she used to sit, she paused. Everything had changed. Not just her job, not just her proximity to power. Her voice had found its place. And somewhere deep inside, she knew this was only the beginning of what she was meant to do. The following week, Eva found herself navigating uncharted territory. Her employee forum had sparked something far greater than she'd anticipated. Word of it spread across departments and up the executive ladder, igniting conversations in corners where silence once ruled. People she barely knew stopped her in the hallways to say, "Thank you for seeing us." It wasn't praise she chased. It was impact. And she was finally beginning to see it. But with that impact came scrutiny. Her presence at leadership meetings became more frequent, and so did the weight of expectations. For every voice she amplified, there was someone who doubted her right to be heard. One particular morning, she was called into a cross-division meeting with department heads. As she entered the glass-paneled boardroom, she noticed a shift in the atmosphere. Chairs were already filled, coffee cups half empty, tension hanging in the air like fog before a storm. Alexander sat at the head, hands clasped, his expression unreadable. Across from him was Gerald Knox, the CFO, one of the old guard. Stern, traditional, and rarely impressed. "Let's get to the point," Gerald said, without preamble. "This employee engagement initiative may have been well-meaning, but it's become a distraction. Morale isn't a metric, and we're not in the business of group therapy." Eva felt the heat rise in her chest, but she steadied her breath. "With all due respect, Mr. Knox, morale affects retention, productivity, and brand trust. That impacts the bottom line more than we like to admit." He raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "That's a nice theory. But our shareholders expect numbers, not narratives." Alexander remained silent. Eva glanced at him, but no lifeline came. She was alone in this defense. She leaned forward. "Then let's look at the numbers. Since the forum, employee turnover dropped by 8%. Sick days decreased. Internal referrals for open positions doubled. People are staying. They're investing back into the company. The room was still. Culture isn't separate from performance, she added. It drives it. Alexander's gaze shifted just slightly, enough for her to know he'd heard her, even if he wasn't saying it. After the meeting, she found herself standing alone in the elevator, exhausted but resolute. The doors were closing when a hand stopped them. Alexander stepped in. Neither of them spoke until the doors slid shut. "You held your ground," he said quietly. "I had to. You didn't look at me for help. I didn't expect it." There was a pause. "That's good," he said, his voice softer. "Because the truth is, I wouldn't have helped, not in front of them. They needed to see that you can handle the pressure yourself." She studied him. "And if I couldn't?" He turned to her. "Then you wouldn't be sitting on that side of the table to begin with." Something passed between them in that moment. Not warmth, not yet, but a thread of understanding that hadn't existed before. Later that week, Ava was invited to an off-site leadership retreat in upstate New York, a 3-day intensive with the company's top brass. It was the kind of event where strategies were born and alliances were forged. The invitation alone marked a shift. The retreat took place in a historic estate surrounded by towering pines and fog-draped lakes. On the first night, after a long day of sessions, the executives gathered in a rustic lounge, sipping wine and making small talk. Ava lingered near the fireplace, alone but observant. Alexander approached, his usual armor of formality tempered by the relaxed setting. "Do you ever let your guard down?" he asked, holding a glass of scotch. She smiled faintly. "Only when I'm alone." He considered her for a moment. "You're not like them. Neither are you," she said, before she could stop herself. He laughed, an honest, quiet laugh. "Maybe that's why we make them so nervous." They stood in silence for a moment, the crackle of the fire between them. Then he spoke again, more contemplative this time. "I used to think control was the only way to lead," he said. "The more detached I was, the better I performed. But lately, I'm not so sure." Eva looked at him, seeing not the CEO, but the man behind the role. "It's not weakness to care, Alexander. It's risk. But sometimes, that's where real change begins." He turned to her, his expression shifting. "You're not just changing the company, Eva. You're changing me." She felt her heart skip. It was too much, too soon, yet undeniable. The next morning, during a leadership hike through the forest trails surrounding the estate, they walked side by side. There were no speeches, no scripts, just their footsteps and the early autumn breeze. "You know," he said, glancing over at her, "the first time I saw you, I thought you were replaceable. Just another nameplate behind a desk." Eva smiled. "And now, I see you as irreplaceable. That terrifies me." She stopped walking, the sunlight catching the gold in her eyes. "Then don't run from it." Alexander looked at her, truly looked, and for the first time, he didn't seem like a man trying to calculate the odds. He seemed like someone ready to take a chance. Neither of them said another word as they continued walking, but everything had changed. The next chapter was beginning, and neither of them was quite prepared for what it would demand of them. But both were finally ready to face it. By the time they returned from the retreat, something unspoken pulsed between them, an invisible thread tugging at the boundaries they'd carefully drawn. They hadn't crossed a line, but they had stepped dangerously close to it. Eva felt it in the way Alexander looked at her during meetings, no longer just assessing her performance, but seeing her in full dimension. She felt it in herself, too, the quiet anticipation when their paths were about to cross, the silent disappointment when they didn't. But life at the company didn't pause for emotions. Alexander had made it clear, through action, if not words, that he valued Eva not only as a leader, but as a cornerstone of the culture shift they were nurturing. And as that shift took root, it was met with resistance. One of the company's largest clients began raising concerns about the transparency efforts and internal reforms Eva was helping lead. They claimed the changes created instability, a word corporate clients used when they meant discomfort. Behind closed doors, Eva learned the client had close ties to Charles Langston, a longtime board member who had never hidden his disdain for what he called idealistic experiments. The following week, Eva received a formal request to present an updated vision of the company's transformation to the board. Alone, when she stepped into the boardroom, she was met with cold eyes and guarded expressions. These were the people who had once welcomed Alexander's detached efficiency. Now they were being asked to embrace something else, something Eva represented. She began without preamble. "This is not about changing what works," she said. "It's about confronting what no longer does." She showed data, but she also told stories of team members who had nearly left but chose to stay, of small ideas that became cost-saving innovations because people finally felt heard, of the shift from fear-driven silence to cautious optimism. Langston interrupted. "Optimism doesn't pay dividends." Eva didn't flinch. "Neither does employee turnover or brand erosion. If we keep pretending these things are separate from our bottom line, we'll be having the same conversation in a much worse position next quarter." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. After the presentation, as the board broke for private discussion, Eva stepped into the hallway and leaned against the wall, willing her hands to stop trembling. Minutes later, Alexander appeared beside her. "You made an impression," he said. She gave a soft laugh. "That's one word for it." "They're not used to being challenged like that." "Well, they should get used to it." He turned toward her. "You know, every time you speak up like that, I think about how close I came to not bringing you to that gala." She looked at him. "And every time, I think about how close I came to saying no." There was something fragile in the moment, something neither of them was brave enough to name. But the vulnerability was there, like a current under the surface. That night, Eva received an email from Alexander. It wasn't about work. It was one line. "Would you join me for dinner tomorrow? No suits, no strategy." She stared at the screen for a long time before replying. "Only if there's dessert." He responded with a single word. "Always." The next evening, they met at a quiet restaurant tucked away from the city noise. Alexander arrived first, already seated when Eva walked in, wearing a soft green dress, her hair down. No trace of the workplace armor they both wore daily. He stood when she approached, his eyes holding something warmer than professionalism. "You look different," he said. She tilted her head. "Better or worse?" He gave her a rare, unguarded smile. "Like yourself." Dinner passed in easy conversation. They talked about childhood summers, the books they loved, the people who had shaped them. It felt like slipping into a space neither of them had known they needed. As they stepped outside after the meal, the night air was crisp. The city lights a muted glow around them. Alexander hesitated, then turned to her. I'm not sure what this is, he admitted, but I don't want it to be nothing. Eva met his gaze, her voice soft but certain. Then don't let it be. He took a step closer, then stopped. May I? She nodded, and in the middle of a quiet sidewalk, beneath a flickering street lamp, Alexander kissed her. It wasn't perfect. It was cautious, hesitant, full of the tension they'd both tried to ignore. But it was real. When they pulled apart, neither spoke. They didn't need to. Because in that silence, a new chapter had begun. But even the most beautiful beginnings cast long shadows. And neither of them knew yet how deeply their personal choice would ripple through the professional world they were still trying to transform. The following week tested everything Eva and Alexander had built, both personally and professionally. News broke that a former employee had filed a claim against one of Carter and Rowe's regional branches, accusing the division of suppressing whistleblower reports and protecting unethical managers. The media latched onto the story, headlines spiraling out of control. For a company still recovering its reputation, this wasn't just a setback. It was a direct hit to the heart of their reforms. Eva sat in the executive conference room, surrounded by department heads, as the crisis response team mapped out legal and public relations strategies. She wasn't just another executive now. She was a symbol of the company's new direction. Every question, every glare, every whispered doubt, she felt them all. Alexander sat beside her, expression unreadable, hands clasped in front of him. The room buzzed with blame, theory, and fear, but he hadn't said a word. Until now. We need to own this, he said calmly, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Not just legally, but culturally. The changes we've made weren't surface level. This is the moment we prove that. All eyes turned to him. We conduct a third-party audit, he continued. Open the door fully. If there's more, we find it first. If there's accountability to be had, it starts with us. Some murmured approval. Others looked concerned. Transparency came at a cost, and not everyone was willing to pay it. Eva leaned forward, and we addressed the people, not just the press. This can't be a sterile statement. It has to come from leadership, and it has to come from a place of honesty. If we want people to believe in the new Carter and Rowe, then this is where we show them why they should. The meeting ended with tentative agreement, but the unease lingered. Afterward, Eva retreated to her office, exhaustion pressing down on her shoulders like lead. She stared out the window, the city below, bathed in gold and gray. The kiss with Alexander still echoed in her mind, but it felt like it had happened in another world. One where hope didn't feel so heavy. Moments later, there was a knock at the door. She didn't need to ask who it was. Alexander stepped in, closing the door behind him. He stood quietly for a moment, as if searching for the right tone, the right presence. "You okay?" he asked finally. Eva exhaled a soft laugh. "That's a complicated question today." He nodded and moved to stand beside her at the window. "You were right in that room. I wish being right didn't feel so lonely." He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time since the scandal broke, Eva saw something rare in his expression. Vulnerability. "I keep wondering if this whole thing falls apart. If we do," he said quietly. Eva turned to him. "You mean the company?" He didn't answer right away. "That too." Silence stretched between them again, thick with everything unspoken. "I don't want what happened between us to become collateral damage in a crisis," he said. "It won't," she replied. her voice soft but certain. Unless we let it. He reached for her hand then, not as a gesture of romance but of grounding, as if they both needed to be reminded of something real amid the chaos. By the next day, Eva and Alexander released a joint internal statement acknowledging the claims, outlining the audit process, and reaffirming their commitment to ethical reform. The letter wasn't sanitized. It carried their names, their titles, and their words, unfiltered, accountable, human. The impact was immediate. While external reactions were mixed, inside the company, something shifted. People stopped whispering and started leaning in. Teams volunteered for oversight reviews. Mid-level managers asked for additional ethics training. It wasn't perfect, but it was momentum. That night, Eva received a message from Sarah Langston, daughter of board member Charles Langston and a former department head who had left the company under quiet controversy. Sarah requested a meeting. Eva hesitated. This could be a trap, or worse, a smear attempt. But something in the tone of the message felt genuine. She agreed. They met in a small cafe, away from the business district. Sarah arrived alone, dressed in neutral tones and carrying a slim folder. Her expression was cautious, but not cold. "I didn't reach out to accuse or defend," Sarah said, once they'd ordered coffee. "I reached out because I think the company deserves to know what really happened 3 years ago." Eva listened as Sarah spoke, revealing how misconduct in her department had been buried to protect a high-level executive. She handed Eva the documents, internal emails, reports, a confidential memo from the legal team urging silence. It was damning. "Why now?" Eva asked. "Because I see what you're trying to do," Sarah said, "and because I think my father was wrong about you." When Eva returned to headquarters with the file, she walked straight into Alexander's office. He looked up, brows lifted. "What is it?" She dropped the folder on his desk. "The truth. And it's worse than we thought." He opened it and began to read. His expression darkened. "This goes straight to the top," he muttered. "Then we go higher," Eva said. She didn't wait for his approval. In that moment, Eva knew she had crossed a threshold, no longer just part of the leadership, but its moral spine. And whether Alexander stood beside her or not, she wasn't going back. Not now. Not ever. The following week passed like a storm sweeping through Carter and Row. The documents Eva had received from Sarah Langston were reviewed by an independent counsel within 24 hours, and by the next morning, Eva and Alexander were standing in front of the board. The room was heavy with anticipation. Charles Langston, Sarah's father, sat near the head of the long walnut table, his jaw tight, expression unreadable. Eva had barely slept the night before, but she stood with her spine straight and her voice unwavering. The evidence confirms deliberate suppression of whistleblower reports and internal legal advice ignored in favor of preserving power, she began. These actions are not just legal liabilities. They betray the culture we're fighting to rebuild. She passed printed copies of the documents to each board member. The silence in the room became oppressive. Alexander stood beside her, but didn't speak. He let her lead. She needed to. When she finished, Robert Kane, one of the senior board members, leaned forward. "This implicates a sitting executive. Are you aware of the risk this poses if it goes public?" Eva nodded. "Yes. And we are equally aware of the greater risk if it doesn't." Charles Langston finally spoke. "These are my daughter's files?" "Yes," Eva replied evenly. He didn't look at her, so she comes back, after 3 years of silence, hands over sensitive information, and we just accept it as gospel? Eva held his gaze. Your daughter had nothing to gain and everything to lose. That sounds like integrity to me. A murmur ran through the room. The meeting stretched for over 2 hours, with arguments raised, motives questioned, and lines quietly drawn. But by the end, the majority voted in favor of an official investigation. The executive named in the documents was placed on immediate administrative leave. The internal culture team was tasked with issuing a company-wide disclosure. When Eva stepped out of the boardroom, her hands were trembling. She didn't realize how tightly she'd been holding herself until Alexander caught up beside her and said quietly, "You just did something most people in that room would never dare." "I wasn't brave," she said, brushing a hand through her hair. "I was furious. Sometimes," he said, "they're the same thing." Later that evening, as rain streaked across the tall windows of the executive floor, Alexander knocked on the open door to Eva's office. "Can I come in?" he asked. She looked up from a clutter of emails and nodded. "I think we need to talk," he said, closing the door behind him. She leaned back, tired but present. "About the company?" "No," he said, "about us." Eva's breath caught slightly. "Alexander, I've spent so much of my life trying to stay in control of everything," he interrupted. "And for the first time, I don't want to control this. I just want to be honest." She stayed silent, listening. "I know things between us have happened fast and under pressure, but I haven't stopped thinking about that night. About you. About what it means when someone doesn't just challenge you, but believes in you, even when you don't." Eva swallowed hard, her chest tightening. "This job, this moment, it's already on fire. You know that, right?" "I do," he said, stepping closer. "But I also know I don't want to keep pretending that what I feel for you is separate from all this, because it's not. You've been the most important voice in my life these past months, Eva, and I don't know what happens next, but I need you to know that." She stood, facing him. The tension between them had shifted again, not the tense pull of opposing forces, but the weight of something fragile asking to be held. "I'm scared," she admitted, "because this matters to me. You matter to me. And if it all goes wrong, then we'll face it," he said softly, "but not in silence." She reached out, threading her fingers with his. No promises, no declarations, just a quiet acknowledgement of everything that now stood between them and for them. The next morning, the company's official transparency initiative was launched. Eva led the internal live stream from the media room, delivering a speech on accountability, progress, and collective ownership. Alexander stood just off camera, watching her with quiet pride. Emails flooded in afterward, some angry, some grateful, some confused, but all of them engaging, proof that the silence had been broken. By the end of the week, Carter and Rowe had become a case study in crisis response. News outlets interviewed Eva. Analysts praised the leadership shift. Stock prices, once volatile, began to stabilize. But beneath it all, Eva knew this wasn't the end of the storm, just a clearing. She and Alexander spent long hours in meetings and long evenings walking through the city together, sometimes talking, sometimes saying nothing at all. The world still questioned them. So did they. But there was something stronger growing in the spaces between doubt. a quiet belief that maybe what they were building, both at work and beyond it, could actually last. And for the first time in her life, Ava didn't just hope for a future she couldn't control. She was ready to fight for it. The months that followed tested every inch of progress Carter and Rowe had made. The Transparency Initiative, while praised publicly, stirred unrest internally. Some departments welcomed the changes with cautious optimism. Others resisted, still clinging to old hierarchies and fears. But Eva held her ground. She knew that culture didn't change with statements and slogans. It changed with behavior, with difficult conversations, and with a refusal to revert when pressure mounted. One of the most delicate confrontations came when the Compliance Division, long known for its closed-door policies, delayed implementing the new feedback protocols. Eva requested a meeting with the department's head, a veteran executive named Malcolm Rourke, who had been with the company since its early days. Rourke arrived to the meeting with the confidence of someone who believed his tenure made him untouchable. But Eva didn't flinch. "We're not auditing this department because we distrust it," she told him calmly. "We're doing it because trust has to be earned and protected." Rourke narrowed his eyes. "You've made a lot of people nervous, Eva. This campaign of yours, it's shifting focus away from performance." Eva leaned forward. "Culture is performance. If you don't believe that, you're already losing ground." The silence that followed was telling. Rourke didn't argue further, and within the week, his department began the audit. Back in the executive suite, Alexander had become more than just CEO. He had become an ally in transformation. He and Eva had struck an unspoken rhythm. They didn't always agree, but they had learned how to fight fair, how to debate without breaking, how to stand together when decisions were made. One Friday evening, Ava was walking through the lobby, ready to call it a night, when she was stopped by a young intern named Naomi. "Miss Taylor," she said, hesitating slightly, "I just wanted to say thank you for speaking up, for showing us we don't have to stay quiet when something feels wrong." Eva was caught off guard. She offered a warm smile. "Thank you for saying that. You're why we do this." The moment lingered in her mind long after she left the building. It reminded her that real change wasn't measured in headlines or shareholder approval. It was measured in moments like that. Later that night, she met Alexander for dinner at a quiet rooftop restaurant. The city below shimmered in the autumn dusk, the air crisp with the promise of approaching winter. They sat across from each other, both a little tired but at ease. "I've been thinking," Alexander said, tracing the rim of his glass, "about what happens after this, after we rebuild, after the noise fades." Eva raised an eyebrow. "You think there's an after?" He laughed. "I hope so, don't you?" She looked out at the skyline, letting the question settle. "I think the work never ends, but maybe the way we carry it changes." He reached across the table, fingers brushing hers. "Would you ever consider something else? Leading something new together?" Eva met his eyes. "You mean outside of Carter and Rowe?" He nodded. "Eventually. We've built something powerful here. But I keep wondering, what if there's more to build?" She didn't answer right away, but something inside her stirred. Not hesitation, but vision. The possibility of a future shaped not just by what they were fixing, but by what they might create from scratch. The next day, Eva received an invitation to speak at a global ethics and leadership summit. The committee chair, impressed by her recent initiatives, wanted her to lead a panel on cultural reform in legacy corporations. When she told Alexander, he looked genuinely proud. "You should do it," he said. "You've earned that stage." She hesitated. "It's international. I'd be away for a week." "So?" Eva smiled. "So I don't want to leave you in a pressure cooker." He stepped closer, touching her cheek. "You've already shown me how to stay calm in fire." They stood quietly for a moment, the unspoken connection between them stronger than it had ever been. A week later, Eva boarded the plane to Zurich. The summit was hosted in a glass-domed hall overlooking the snow-dusted Alps. She spoke to a room filled with leaders from industries across the globe, telling the story of Carter and Rowe's evolution and of her own. She didn't just talk about policies and protocols. She talked about vulnerability, about resistance, about the power of being underestimated, and the strength it took to choose the hard path anyway. When she finished, the standing ovation startled her. She had prepared for questions, maybe even doubt, but what she saw in the faces around her was recognition, respect. Back in New York, Alexander watched the live stream from his office. He leaned back in his chair, a quiet smile on his face. She wasn't just transforming the company. She was becoming a voice people listened to far beyond it. When Eva returned, Alexander met her at the airport. No fanfare, just a quiet moment beneath the terminal lights. "You're late," he teased. "Blame the snow," she said, grinning. They stood there, bags forgotten, the chaos of travel forgotten. In the mess of their lives, they had found clarity in each other, in their mission, and in the future they were slowly but deliberately shaping. As they walked out into the night, Eva felt something different in the air. Not peace, not certainty, but a sense of becoming. And for the first time, that was enough. The following weeks tested Eva on a level she had never anticipated. The speech she gave at the summit had echoed far beyond the marble walls of the hotel ballroom. Media outlets picked it up, naming her a rising voice for modern corporate leadership. Internally, however, the ripples of change she set in motion stirred resistance. At the headquarters of Sterling and Rowe, tension hung heavy in the air. Executives accustomed to the old ways began subtly pushing back against her initiatives. Budget approvals were delayed. Department heads held back data she needed. Whispers began circulating, questioning whether Eva was moving too fast, or worse, whether she belonged in the position at all. One morning, while reviewing the Q3 performance metrics, Eva noticed anomalies in the numbers submitted by the operations team. They weren't major, but they were inconsistent. She reached out for a deeper audit and discovered something alarming. Performance reports had been quietly manipulated to hide project inefficiencies. It was subtle, but deliberate, and it pointed towards someone inside her leadership circle. Alexander was in New York that week, managing investor relations, so Eva had to move alone. She called an emergency meeting with the internal compliance team and the CFO, laying out what she had found. Her tone was steady, but inside she was burning with frustration. She had fought too hard, given up too much, to allow deception to fester beneath the surface of change. "Full transparency," she said firmly. "We either own our flaws or we become defined by them." That afternoon, while walking through the hallway, she overheard a conversation between two senior managers. "She's turning this place into a political circus. Or she's just trying to get rid of the old guard." The words stung more than she wanted to admit. But Eva had learned to turn pain into purpose. Instead of letting it wear her down, she organized a town hall meeting, open to every employee, from interns to executives. She wanted to speak directly, honestly. On the day of the event, the atrium was filled. Some stood with folded arms, skeptical. Others watched with anticipation. Eva stood in front of them, not as someone who had all the answers, but as someone determined to ask the right questions. When I started as a receptionist, I didn't know where the path would lead, she began, her voice calm but resolute. But I did know one thing. I wanted to be a part of something meaningful. Not just profitable, purposeful. That's what I want for Sterling and Rowe. And I know it won't be easy. Change never is. But we are more than our resistance. We are our resilience. A quiet filled the space when she finished. Then, slowly, applause grew. It wasn't thunderous, but it was sincere. It came from those who believed, and from those who had doubted, now willing to reconsider. That evening, Alexander returned from New York, walking into her office just as she was wrapping up her notes. He didn't say a word at first, just looked at her. "You looked exhausted," he said finally. "I am," she admitted, with a small smile. "But I'm not stopping." He stepped closer, placing a hand on the back of her chair. "You shouldn't have to fight every battle alone." "I'm not alone," she replied quietly, meeting his gaze. They stood in silence for a moment, until Alexander reached into his briefcase and handed her a folder. Inside were letters from investors who had attended the summit, messages of encouragement, of belief, of trust in her vision. Ava flipped through them slowly, her eyes misting. "Sometimes," she said, "the right fight draws the right allies." That weekend, Alexander invited her to a retreat in the countryside, a brief pause from the whirlwind. They walked through tall trees, leaves crackling underfoot, and spoke not of budgets or policies, but of fears, dreams, and everything in between. "You know," Alexander said, as they sat by a lake, watching the sunset, "when I asked you to that gala, I thought I was saving my reputation. But I think you ended up saving something much deeper in me." Eva turned to him, her voice soft. "You saved something in me too. You gave me the first door. I just didn't realize I'd end up walking through all of them." He reached for her hand and held it, not as a CEO or a man of power, but as someone who finally understood the kind of strength that doesn't come from control, but from courage. And in that stillness, with the sky ablaze in orange and gold, they found not just peace, but purpose. Together. Eva knew the challenges weren't over. The board would continue to scrutinize. The media would shift with the wind. But the foundation was laid, not just for a company reborn, but for a partnership rooted in shared values, resilience, and something neither of them had planned for. Love born not from fantasy, but forged in fire. The following weeks tested Eva on a level she had never anticipated. The speech she gave at the summit had echoed far beyond the marble walls of the hotel ballroom. Media outlets picked it up, naming her a rising voice for modern corporate leadership. Internally, however, the ripples of change she set in motion stirred resistance. At the headquarters of Sterling and Rowe, tension hung heavy in the air. Executives accustomed to the old ways began subtly pushing back against her initiatives. Budget approvals were delayed. Department heads held back data she needed. Whispers began circulating. questioning whether Eva was moving too fast or worse, whether she belonged in the position at all. One morning, while reviewing the Q3 performance metrics, Eva noticed anomalies in the numbers submitted by the operations team. They weren't major, but they were inconsistent. She reached out for a deeper audit and discovered something alarming. Performance reports had been quietly manipulated to hide project inefficiencies. It was subtle, but deliberate, and it pointed towards someone inside her leadership circle. Alexander was in New York that week, managing investor relations, so Eva had to move alone. She called an emergency meeting with the internal compliance team and the CFO, laying out what she had found. Her tone was steady, but inside she was burning with frustration. She had fought too hard, given up too much, to allow deception to fester beneath the surface of change. Full transparency, she said firmly. We either own our flaws or we become defined by them. That afternoon, while walking through the hallway, she overheard a conversation between two senior managers. She's turning this place into a political circus. Or she's just trying to get rid of the old guard. The words stung more than she wanted to admit. But Eva had learned to turn pain into purpose. Instead of letting it wear her down, she organized a town hall meeting, open to every employee, from interns to executives. She wanted to speak directly, honestly. On the day of the event, the atrium was filled. Some stood with folded arms, skeptical. Others watched with anticipation. Eva stood in front of them, not as someone who had all the answers, but as someone determined to ask the right questions. When I started as a receptionist, I didn't know where the path would lead. She began, her voice calm but resolute. But I did know one thing. I wanted to be a part of something meaningful, not just profitable, purposeful. That's what I want for Sterling and Rowe, and I know it won't be easy. Change never is. But we are more than our resistance. We are our resilience. A quiet filled the space when she finished. Then, slowly, applause grew. It wasn't thunderous, but it was sincere. It came from those who believed, and from those who had doubted, now willing to reconsider. That evening, Alexander returned from New York, walking into her office just as she was wrapping up her notes. He didn't say a word at first, just looked at her. You looked exhausted, he said finally. I am, she admitted with a small smile. But I'm not stopping. He stepped closer, placing a hand on the back of her chair. You shouldn't have to fight every battle alone. I'm not alone, she replied quietly, meeting his gaze. They stood in silence for a moment, until Alexander reached into his briefcase and handed her a folder. Inside were letters from investors who had attended the summit, messages of encouragement, of belief, of trust in her vision. Eva flipped through them slowly, her eyes misting. Sometimes, she said, the right fight draws the right allies. That weekend, Alexander invited her to a retreat in the countryside, a brief pause from the whirlwind. They walked through tall trees, leaves crackling underfoot, and spoke not of budgets or policies, but of fears, dreams, and everything in between. You know, Alexander said, as they sat by a lake watching the sunset, when I asked you to that gala, I thought I was saving my reputation, but I think you ended up saving something much deeper in me. Eva turned to him, her voice soft. You saved something in me too. You gave me the first door. I just didn't realize I'd end up walking through all of them. He reached for her hand and held it, not as a CEO or a man of power, but as someone who finally understood the kind of strength that doesn't come from control, but from courage. And in that stillness, with the sky ablaze in orange and gold, they found not just peace, but purpose, together. Eva knew the challenges weren't over. The board would continue to scrutinize. The media would shift with the wind. But the foundation was laid, not just for a company reborn, but for a partnership rooted in shared values, resilience, and something neither of them had planned for. Love born not from fantasy, but forged in fire. A few months later, the sun rose over Sterling and Rowe's glass tower with a quiet promise. Inside the building, it wasn't just another Monday. It was the start of a new chapter. The company's boardroom, once a place of tense debate and veiled power plays, now buzzed with something different: hope. Eva stood at the head of the long, polished table, presenting the final rollout of the internal integrity program she had worked so long to build. With her signature mix of clarity and calm confidence, she outlined how every department, from HR to finance, would be trained to not only identify, but prevent the very types of internal manipulation that had almost derailed them months ago. She didn't speak in abstractions. She spoke from experience, from scars earned and wisdom gained. And when she concluded with, "We are not just evolving our brand, we are redefining our values," the room responded not with applause, but with nods of respect. That meant more. Alexander, now officially appointed as executive chair, remained silent for a moment before standing. "I've been in this room more times than I can count," he said, eyes on the team. "But today, it doesn't feel like the same company. That's because of her." He gestured toward Eva. "She taught me, and all of us, that leadership isn't about holding power. It's about sharing it, trusting it, building something bigger than ourselves." No one missed the pride in his voice or the way his gaze lingered on her. Outside that room, life moved on. Stocks ticked up, teams collaborated, departments hummed with purpose. But at the core of it all, something deeper had shifted. People began showing up not just because they were paid to, but because they felt seen. Because the culture Eva cultivated gave them permission to care. That evening, she walked into her office and found a small box on her desk. Inside was a delicate key-shaped pendant and a note in Alexander's handwriting. "For the woman who unlocked what I never knew I was missing." Eva sat for a moment, letting the silence wrap around her. She thought about the gala night that started it all. The hesitation, the unspoken rules. The moment she chose to speak, not for attention, but for truth. How everything had unraveled, and then rebuilt, stronger. That night, she and Alexander met at the same rooftop where they had shared their first moment of real honesty. "Do you ever wonder how different things could have been if you'd chosen someone else that night?" she asked him with a smile. He stepped closer, slipping his fingers between hers. "Every day. And every day, I thank God I didn't." Above them, the stars shimmered with quiet approval. As they looked over the city, a city that once questioned if they could lead, if they could rise, if they could last, they knew the answer wasn't just in numbers or headlines. It was in the people who now walked Sterling and Rowe's halls with pride. It was in the unshakable belief that resilience, when rooted in empathy, becomes unstoppable. And it was in the story of a woman who was once a receptionist, and a man who almost lost himself in power, finding their way, not just to each other, but to something far greater. Not a fairy tale, something real, something earned. When Ethan Walker asked his receptionist, Claire Bennett, to attend a gala dinner in place of a last-minute cancellation, he never imagined that single moment would become the catalyst for a transformation far greater than either of them could foresee. What began as a practical decision quickly unraveled into a journey of courage, redemption, and profound personal growth. Claire, once invisible in the backdrop of a powerful corporation, emerged as the voice of integrity and quiet strength. Her presence didn't just shift conversations in boardrooms, it altered the very course of a company drowning in its own detachment. Ethan, a man once defined by control and stoicism, found himself confronting emotions he had long buried. In Claire's honesty, he discovered not just a partner, but a mirror, one that forced him to confront his fear of vulnerability and relinquish his grip on outdated ideas of leadership. Their story is a reminder that leadership isn't a title, it's a responsibility, that the people with the least power on paper can possess the strongest sense of purpose. Claire never sought attention. She simply did what was right, again and again, until the world could no longer ignore her. Ethan, in turn, realized that the walls he had built around himself in the name of professionalism were only barriers to the truth, to connection, to love. In the end, it wasn't strategy or status that saved the company. It was empathy, transparency, two people choosing to walk through fear instead of running from it. We live in a time where appearances often drown out substance, where control is mistaken for strength. But this story teaches us that real change begins the moment someone dares to speak with honesty in a room full of silence. That when we let go of who we're supposed to be, we step into who we were meant to become. Claire and Ethan taught us that trust is built in moments of friction, that love often grows in the space between disagreement and understanding, and that integrity, once awakened, is unstoppable. So if you've been doubting your voice, feeling unseen, or waiting for permission to step forward, this is your reminder. You don't need a title to make a difference. You need courage. And if you have the courage to stay true to your values, to lead with empathy, to love without fear, then you already have everything it takes to change your world. Thank you for joining us on this unforgettable journey. If this story touched your heart, inspired reflection, or gave you hope, please subscribe to our channel. Your support fuels the stories we share and gives us the motivation to continue bringing meaningful, emotional narratives to life. We can't wait to walk with you through the next one. Until then, keep believing in the power of truth, the beauty of growth, and the strength of love that refuses to be silenced.